David and Adele and Ben. That's a long. You can come on up. And we're glad that Dale's for his message last week, and I'm sure we all look forward to his teachings this week, starting right now. Thank you.
Okay. Now, first of all, let me say I am honored and privileged to be back at Lake James. It's been a while, and every time I come, I look forward to it with anticipation, and I'm thrilled with the opportunity to be here, and I'm honored when you folks give me the privilege of sharing with you. Now, Lake James is a special place, and I think we got a picture we can throw up here for a couple of reasons. Now, the Apostle Paul in the book of Hebrews says, "For now we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses." Now, he just got through talking about some of the people from ages past, the prophets and all that, and what they had gone through and suffered with. But then when he switches and he says, "We're now surrounded," he speaks in present voice. In other words, he's not talking about those people back then. He's talking about people that had been around him and that had been a testimony and a witness to him, and for that reason gave him the strength and the faith to face what he was facing in his life and his ministry. There are people like that around me that have given me that desire, that strength, that commitment to keep going. They're part of my great cloud of witnesses. And one of those was Brother Tom Frisney. Now, this picture was taken the very last time that he and I were here together, and we were chatting, and we were right here in the back of the building talking after one of these services and discussing things. And of course, he had been my professor when I was in Bible college, and he had been my friend and a supporter of the work we were doing in Columbia from that day until the day the Lord called him home. And this particular day, as we talked, he was discussing things that he had done and his life and his concerns. And as he was an elderly gentleman at this time, and obviously has a good part of his life behind him and not too much ahead of him, he talked and he said, "I had a book I wrote on the book of Revelations, a commentary that is out of print." And he says, "That concerns me," because he says there's so much wrong information and bad teaching coming out of the book of Revelation that people misuse it. It's important that the church have an accurate view of what God was doing in the book of Revelation. And he said, "I'm a little bit concerned that my commentary is out of print." Well, I said, "Your commentary isn't out of print, because at that time I had already translated it into Spanish, and we had begun to print it in Spanish for the churches in Columbia, and we were using it." And he hadn't heard about that up until that time, and I informed him that particular day, and he was thrilled by that. I had a couple copies that I brought to put on my display, since it was one of the newer books that we had published, and I gave him a couple of copies of his book in the Spanish language. And so Tom Frisney is one of my great cloud of witnesses, perhaps for some of you as well. And he's a person that has given me inspiration when the times get tough to keep going. And as he was faithful to the end, my determination is that I also will work until the day the Lord calls me home, as he did. Because if the Lord has you here on this earth, it's for a reason. And whatever that reason is, you need to be doing it. You need to be fulfilling that purpose. And when you get done, and when you complete the task he's given you, you will be given the privilege of being called home into his presence forever. And so that's Brother Tom Frisney there. Now, this week we're talking about some different things, and one of the things we're talking about is ministry and service and all that. And we have, of course, our theme, and our theme is in your brochure here. You can find that in your school missions thing. And that particular passage is one also from the book of Hebrews. It says, "Let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith." Now, how do we do that? Well, if we go back into the Bible from day one until the very end of Revelation, we see a characteristic, and that characteristic is going to be my theme for these Bible studies this week. And so that particular characteristic is a covenant relationship. Now, what's a covenant relationship in the Bible? Well, we'll get into that here in just about a minute or two and talk about it. But I want you to start thinking about a covenant relationship, what that means to you, covenant relationships that maybe you're familiar with and have experienced, or your concept of what they are in the Bible. Now, I do have a display out here, and I got some items, and every day I'll show you one item from the display. This is some horse equipment because we ride horses a lot in Colombia when we're out on the ranches. I, every year, spend a good bit of time in the saddle as we're going to preach. If I'm working out in the countryside and it's time to bring the cattle in for branding or whatever, I jump on a horse and I help with that process. So I ride horses a lot and I get used to their equipment. And this is some horse equipment from Colombia. As you can see, the stirrups are very different from ours. They're not those boot-like things that we have. And there's a good reason for that. If you ever watch the old cowboy movies, which I did when I was a kid, you notice every little bit, some cowboy gets thrown, and what happens? The horse drags him along and he can't get his foot out of the stirrup and he's banging his head on the prairie and all that, and it's a dramatic time. Well, they don't have that problem because they use toe stirrups. And they ride barefoot and they simply hook their toes over the stirrup like this. Horse throws them, no problem. They just fall to the ground, get up and probably say a few bad words and get their horse again and get back on and keep going. And so a toe stirrup is a very practical way to ride. It doesn't have the risk. Also, if you notice something about their spurs, they're different, right? And people say, those spurs are made wrong. Well, those spurs are not made wrong. What happens is that our cowboy culture disappeared basically in the late 1800s. And then we started reliving it through all these cowboy movies that were popular in the 60s, and they still have in reruns from what I'm told. Well, when they were hiring actors for the cowboy movies, they always hired big, tall guys. Every actor that played in one of those movies was over 6 foot tall. They wouldn't hire short, little, scrawny runt like me. And so it was always tall guys. Well, spur is made to roll down the flank of the horse to get him to either turn or to go faster or whatever. If you're 6 foot tall, your feet hang down below the belly of most horses. So you can't poke them in the side, so you come up underneath the belly with your foot. You kind of bend your foot and come up and you roll it along the horse's belly. So if you're over 6 foot tall, your spurs have to be vertical. If you're a short guy like me and your leg doesn't hang down below the side of the horse, the spurs have to be horizontal. And so a spur is horizontal up to a certain height, and depending on the size of the horse, it's vertical if you're taller than that. That's the way it was here 100 years ago. That's the way it still is in Colombia. So we can show you quite a few things about Colombian life out on the display. Almost everything I have out there is from daily use in Colombia. Now, you notice you almost always see me wearing a hat. In fact, somebody said, if you ever leave your hat at home, nobody will recognize you. That's probably true. I wear a hat for two reasons. One, in Colombia, everybody wore hats, and I did as well to keep from getting burned. Also, I had a pretty bad case of skin cancer here about 25 years ago now, and after I had my chemotherapy and my treatment, my dermatologist said, you always wear a hat, because if you don't, your skin is very sensitive after the chemotherapy, and you'll burn much more easily. And she told me, even under fluorescent lights, you need to wear a hat. And so if you see me wearing a hat, it's not because I'm disrespectful. It's not because my mom didn't teach me right when I was a little kid. It's because I've got doctor's orders. And on top of that, in Colombia, it's just not a custom to take your hat off when you go in a building. They have a saying, and it's, mi caballo cuatro patas plantado firmemente en la sabana. My horse firmly planted on the prairie. Yo firmemente en la silla de mi caballo. I am firmly planted on my horse's saddle, or on my horse. And then, mi sombrero firmemente sobre la cabeza. My hat is firmly on my head. And then, Dios está firmemente sobre todo. God is firmly in control over all. And so wearing a hat for them is sort of like the Jewish custom. It's to remind them that God is over them, protecting them the way a hat serves to protect us. Now, those are some little things from Colombia that I'll tell you about. And every day I'm going to give you one of my missionary stories. Every missionary winds up with some stories, because we wind up probably doing some dumb stuff we shouldn't and getting in trouble. And the Lord usually gets us out of it. Most of the years I was in Colombia, there was a war going on. And it was a very, very dangerous place to live. And there was a lot of persecution. They were killing the Christians. A person that was a Christian often was murdered because of that. And if you look at the Voice of the Martyrs through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, Colombia was usually one of the countries that was featured as one of the most dangerous countries in the world for Christians. And so we had this one group of one town where a bunch of people had become Christians. Persecution was starting. They were very much afraid that they were going to be killed off. And so the entire village almost picked up and moved. They just left what they had and took off. And they went and they moved and they found a location way out in the jungle prairie region on a talus cone on the edge of the Andes Mountains. Now, talus cone is where the mountain comes down very, very steep. The erosion and everything brings dirt down. It forms sort of a plateau-like, and then often there's a little bit of a drop-off, and it goes to the prairie and the rivers. So they had found one of these talus cones that was kind of like a big U shape, and it was about 700 or 800 feet up in the air on almost a very vertical cliff. And then behind them, the mountains went almost straight up. So it was sort of like a natural fortress that was protected. They figured they could move there, and if anybody tried to attack them, they could defend themselves. And because it was so remote, they thought, probably nobody will bother us here. Well, they had invited us to go out and preach, since I'd known these people from before, and we were going to go there and preach. The trouble was, it was about 20 days by horse and trail and everything to get there. And if we preached for 4 or 5 days and got back another 20 days, you're talking about almost 2 months to go and preach for a week. So by that time, we had purchased a small airplane to reach some of these areas that we could not get to by horse and everything easily and quickly. And I was flying this small airplane. It was a Cessna single-engine airplane. And I had to measure how long the main road or street of the village was. So on this talus cone, and they built their village in the shape of a cross. They had the main road, went straight up the hill, ended at the Andes Mountains, and they built their church building right there. Had a crossbar there, and they had houses along here and down this way, and then the road up the middle was an open spot. I had to measure it. It was about 600 feet long. Now, normally for an airplane, you need 1,000 or 1,200 feet to take off and land. This was 600 feet, about half of the length I needed. But I asked them how high the cliff was, and they said, well, it's about, they gave me about 300 meters, something like that. Okay, about 900 feet, something like that. All right. So I talked to my friend. I said, let's go. We'll go in the airplane. Okay, that's fine. He was a little bit concerned. That's not a very big space, and he had flown with me enough. He kind of knew. We flew out there, and I was able to land in that 600 feet because it's uphill like this. It's a talus cone. It's flat, but it's sloping. So as I landed, going uphill, obviously going uphill, you don't roll very fast or very far, and I was able to stop the airplane, and we parked it, and spent our week there preaching and teaching and doing all that kind of stuff. Time got ready to leave, and I told the guy that was flying with me, I said, now, I don't have enough distance to get flying speed before we go over the edge of the cliff. But I can get up to about 60 miles an hour in the number of feet that I had. I'd calculated ahead how much space I had and what speed I could get. I said, I'm only going to need about another 200 feet or so, and I can get the speed I need flying. So what I'll do is I'll take off, going as fast as I can with the airplane. I'll gun the engine, and I'll take off, and we'll get to the edge of the cliff, and I'll simply dive off the edge of the cliff and go nose down for about 200 or 300 feet. I'll be able to gain speed and pull out, and we'll take off. He says, okay. So we get ready to take off. We get there, I gun the engine, let the brakes loose, and whoom, off we go down. I get to the end of the strip, and obviously I don't have the speed. So as we go off, of course, the plane whoom, drops because it doesn't have flying speed. So I just nose it down, and we're headed straight down toward the ground. About 2,000 feet a minute is how fast a plane goes when it's headed that way. And I drop it for about 200 or 300 feet. I get the airspeed that I need, and I'm able to pull off and take off. But when I go over the cliff and drop, even though I'd told him what we're doing, I warned him, we dropped off the cliff, he throws his hands up, he goes, oh, Lord, help us. Pulled out, and I said, see, the Lord helped us. And now, that may sound foolish, but it wasn't, for 2 reasons. One, I had been very well trained, and I knew what I could do with that airplane. The second, by then I'd been flying that airplane for quite a while, and I was very familiar with my airplane, and I knew what my airplane could do. And so I calculated very carefully the distance, the speed I could get in that distance, then how far I would have to drop before I would find airspeed sufficient to fly so that I could pull out. And I made sure that I had enough of a cushion that I was able to make that curve and pull out. So while it sounds crazy, it was a calculated thing, and I knew what I could do and how I could do it. Now, we look at the Bible, and we find some things there that are pretty interesting. And one of those things is where we see the Apostle Paul in the end of his life. He had been arrested a second time. He was in Rome. He had already been condemned to death, and his execution date had been set. He knew he was going to die for preaching the gospel. He had been given the opportunity to recant, to denounce Jesus, to say, no, Jesus didn't resurrect from the dead, and you can live. And he refused to do it. And so he faced death. And as he faced death, he wrote to Timothy, and he said these particular words. We have then stable ground on which to stand through all of life's certainties. For Jesus prepares us for tragedy and suffering. Now, that's one of the modern translations. You probably know it in the traditional one, which says, because I know in whom I have believed, and I am persuaded that he is able to guard what has been entrusted to me until that day. And by that day, he refers to the date set for his execution. So he looked at his own execution. I probably would have been complaining. I probably would have been belly aching. I'd have probably been telling God, hey, I served you all my life. What are you doing here? But Paul didn't do that. He just said, I know in whom I believed, and I can trust him because he is able to keep me until that day. And he did. Now, that's a covenant relationship. It means you commit everything, and you're absolutely certain that no matter what happens, you're going to live through it. Now, we have covenant relationships today, right? Anyone heard of marriage? Probably most of you have. And in marriage, what do? You don't just come and say, hey, we're going to give this a shot and see how it goes. You get up and you take what's called a vow, right? And a vow is a covenant relationship. And you say, to you I'll be faithful, for better, for worse, for sickness, for health, in good times and in bad times, until death do us part. And I kept one covenant relationship until death do us part. And now I'm in another one as well, 3 years also. And I intend to keep that. I tell my wife we're still shooting for that 50 years. I didn't make it the first time, but this time I am determined. No chance of that. But anyhow, however long that is, we'll go. Covenant relationship. What is a covenant relationship? Okay, let's go back to the Bible and look. Now, I told you we're going to be doing some Bible studying, and we're going to be working on that. So let's go to our Bible. If you have your Bibles with you, I'd like you to turn to the book of Genesis, the first book in the Bible. Now, when I talked last night, I introduced the covenant relationship. Now, I didn't take too much time to explain it because I was a little bit limited, and we were in a church service type setting and all that, but it was the first teaching on a covenant relationship. And that covenant relationship, as I told you last night, was... Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I've commanded. And if you do, remember, conditional conjunction, I will be with you until the ends of the earth. That's a covenant relationship. He promises something to you. You commit to something to him. But then notice, it isn't bilateral. It's trilateral because it reaches out from you to those around you. That's the covenant relationship. Back to marriage. Husband and wife and all that. But what happens? Most relationships, at least when you get married sort of young like I did, it isn't too long till you're popping out a kid or two, right? And then your responsibility is with that child to care for them and to nurture them and to raise them. You got the bilateral and then the trilateral element. And that's what we have with God. So let's go to the book of Genesis, chapter 12, and we find here something that's called the proto-evangelium. Now, what's the proto-evangelium? If you've never heard of that word, proto comes from our word prototype, right? You know what prototype is. I'm going to make something. I'll make a model or two to see if it's going to work or not first before we start the actual production. Prototype. Evangelium is the Latin word for the gospel. In the gospel, in Latin, it's evangelium. And so they use the Latin term there, proto-evangelium. In Spanish, it's el evangelio. So we still use basically the Latin terminology there. So the proto-evangelium is a prototype of the gospel. And that's what we have in Genesis 12. Now, this is Abraham. He's living a cushy, comfortable life there with all of his family and his kin and everything over there in Ur Chaldee, and they're having a good time at things. And everything's going great, and he's happy and satisfied and everything, and then all of a sudden something happens that's going to shake that to the foundation. And it says, and now the Lord said to Abram, he's not Abraham yet, he's Abram, go from your country and from your kindred and from your father's house to the land that I'll show you, and I'll make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I'll make your name great, so that you will be a blessing to all peoples, to all the families of the earth. Now, there we have the covenant relationship. God promises something to Abraham. Abraham has to respond by doing something that the Lord asked him to do, and then it's going to be trilateral because it's going to, through him, bless those around him, and then all of the families of the earth. So there is the initial covenant relationship as presented in the gospel in its entirety. And once again, as we see this move forward, we see how Abram, later Abraham, is going to react. Now, the next time we see something like this, we're going to jump forward a little bit, and we're in Genesis 15, verse 10. And now, Abram's getting a little bit worried here, and he says, how do I know all this stuff's going to happen, and how do I know you're going to give me this land and all that? So God talks to him again, and he tells him, go do things. Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Okay, so he brought all these things. He cut them in half. He laid them in half over against one another, and he did not cut the birds. And when the birds of prey came down, Abram drove them away. When the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and behold, a dreadful darkness came upon him. And the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that will not be theirs. They will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And in the King James it says, for the cup of their iniquity has not yet overflown. And so there is that covenant relationship renewed with Abraham. And here it gets more specific, and he tells him exactly what it's going to be. Now, this concept of taking animals and cutting them in half, it's a promise. And as you take the animal and you cut it in half, you lay one half over here and their half over there, then later you walk through it. It's a way of saying, I'm going to keep this commitment. If not, I'm going to be cut in half. I'm going to be destroyed. And so I'm going to promise, but I'm going to go through. I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to go back. I'm not going to end this. I'll go through and I'll finish it. And so he makes that covenant. He makes that promise. And this is the second time we see a covenant relationship presented there. And he tells him what he's going to do, and he tells him what's going to happen, and he tells him how he's supposed to be working and preparing those who come after, his offspring. And he gets in there, he gets very specific. He says, first of all, that part is very important. You hear non-Christians saying, oh, God's so terrible, he sent the Israelites in there to kill all those poor people. Well, he didn't do that until the cup of their iniquity had overflown. In other words, there was no goodness left in them at all. Remember what it says about Noah? It says, and for the thoughts of their heart were only evil continually. And so that's what had happened here. When it reached the point where the thoughts of their heart were only evil continually, there's no longer any, I started to say, no, that's Spanish. It says there's no longer any hope of redemption. It can't happen because there's got to be at least a little bit of good that you can bring good out of. And when there's no good left, you can't. And so as long as the cup of iniquity had not overflown, he was not allowed to touch them. He couldn't lay a hand on anyone. They'd be taken to Egypt and all. 4 generations, it's very specific. 4 generations, he'll come back. Abraham, Isaac, Joseph. Abraham, Isaac, and all. And so exactly 4 generations later, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and Joseph, to get them in there, too many J's in there. Jacob and Joseph, 4 generations, and then they come back. Precision. God made a promise. And God kept his promise. And they came back, as he said, bringing great wealth and great possessions with them. They could make a golden calf, which they weren't supposed to do, but they did. And so they had great possessions. A covenant relationship. And so as we are here today looking at what God wants to do with us. We are in a covenant relationship. Now, what I've done today is I've given you two bookends. One bookend is the Great Commission. That's what's at the one end. The other bookend is Genesis 12 and following. That's the beginning of it. Between those two bookends, we have an entire Bible, an entire book of covenant relationships, promises that God makes to his people, responsibilities that they have in response to him. Now, what we see is God kept his promises, and the people, time after time after time, failed to keep their promise, their end of the bargain. And God, with great patience, waited hundreds of years to bring judgment. But when it reached a point where there was no longer any hope, he gave up. Northern Israel was taken off into captivity and dispersed to disappear from the face of the earth as a people and as a belief system. And so we have that covenant relationship. With those two bookends, what we're going to be doing in the rest of our time together is looking at some of those and studying the implications for us. Now, I want to pause for a minute and think about Abraham, what he was supposed to do. First of all, God told him he could not live this cushy, easy, comfortable life. It wouldn't work. Now, why wouldn't it work? Because when everything's good, we don't worry about anything, do we? We're just chill. And so God had to make Abraham a little bit uncomfortable. There was a second thing God had to do there. Abraham had a good heart, but he wasn't a good guy. Don't believe me? Read about some of the stuff he did. He wasn't a good guy. Now, how do we know that? Well, a little bit later on, when he sends, his grandson back to get a wife and all that, and they get ready to leave, and they take off, and it was Rachel was in her little hut there, and Laban shows up again and says, okay, why'd you steal my daughter? And he said, I didn't steal your daughters. I worked for him, and I paid for them. I gave you all these years of service and all that. They're okay, you're right. You paid what she's worth. You got her for a wife. Then he says, but why did you steal my household gods? What? Why did you steal my idols? Well, I didn't. Well, yeah, she had them under her saddle and she's sitting on them. But why did you steal my idols? They were idolaters like everyone else. Now, they had a belief in God, but mixed with all other beliefs. And so they needed to purify that. Now, Abraham couldn't see that. He didn't see his gods as a problem. He didn't see the idols that his family worshiped as a problem. But when he took him over to what's Palestine today, over to what's the land of Israel, and he saw the idolatry of those people, he saw that as disgusting. Those were nasty gods. Those were terrible gods. And he could see how evil they were. But until he went there and saw that in them, he couldn't see it in himself. Now, I use an illustration here that's pretty good. I often would work at things that are pretty heavy and pretty physical. And if you're in a tropical climate and you're doing that, it isn't too long until you're just absolutely drenched in sweat. And I'd come in after working a little bit, and my wife would call me for lunch or something, and I'd walk in and get ready, and she'd say, before you sit down at that table, go take a bath. She says, you stink. She wasn't always the most adroit and careful person there, and she would talk. So I said, you stink. So I'd go take a shower and all, and I could clean up and I could come down. But you know what? I didn't smell anything. You don't smell your own stench, do you? But somebody else can. And we can't see the wrong and the evil in us, but God sees it as a stench in his nostrils, and that's what his word says. So how do we see that? It takes some time going somewhere else and seeing something else to be able to reflect back on ourselves. Now, I'm supposed to be a social scientist. There's two concepts that social scientists use. One is the emic view of things. Now, what's emic? That means the insider's view. So an emic view is how you see yourself and your culture. The other one is the etic view, the outsider's view of you. And you see different things. There's a guy named Ray Rappaport, and he made a statement once which is quite profound. And he says, never do the basic values of a society stand naked before its own members. Think about that. Never do the basic values of a society stand naked before its own members. In other words, you can't see them, you don't notice them. They're not there. But somebody comes in from outside and they can say, what you guys are doing wrong. Now, what's this all have to do with a missionary? A lot. A lot. What's the relationship between the missionary and the sending church? And for the most part, we have that wrong, to our detriment. Now, wrong in what way? Well, if you go to the Bible and look up elders, how many verses are they related to the eldership? How many? Quite a few, not that many. You go count them. If you take direct ones where it's something like about name elders in all the towns, I think there's 7. And if you talk about just the mention of the name elders, I think it's 23 or something like that. I counted once. That's quite a few, but not a lot. How many are there that talk about the relationship between a missionary and a church where the missionary is correcting the church? Over 2,000. Over 2,000. Now, why? Because when the missionary goes out and he leaves his home society, like Abraham had to leave his own family, and he comes back, he can see things that you don't see in your own church and in your own life. And if the relationship is proper, it's a love relationship, it's a covenant relationship. It's not a critical relationship, it's a helpful relationship. And so the missionary can say, you guys are doing things wrong. Now, I've lived most of my life in a very, very poor country. And I've lived for most of that in a very simple lifestyle. I didn't live all that much different from the people I was living with. And I came back to America and I saw things as I did that shocked me. I had never seen them or noticed them before, but when I'd been there and came back, I could see those things. And what I saw was an American focus on materialism. We focus on things more than we focus on people. And that's wrong. That's not only wrong, that's idolatry. Because we are worshiping the physical creation and not the spiritual creation that God has put in His Spirit within each and every one of us. And that's the value we should see in other people. And that's why we can see in people who have shortcomings and unattractive traits. That's the value we should see in people who are different from us in a physiognometry form and all that. It's what we can see in a person because they are created in the image of God, just like what we are. I'll close with a little story here. We had a friend, a good friend of mine once, and he was kidnapped by the guerrillas. And the guerrillas were going to kill him. They demanded $100,000 ransom or they were going to do him, and they would have. They did. In fact, I know 5 missionaries that were murdered in Colombia because of their faith. And they kidnapped this guy and they were going to kill him. And of course, we missionaries have always said, I don't want anybody to pay ransom. If I ever get kidnapped, please don't pay ransom. Because you pay ransom for one missionary, every missionary in the world is at risk. So I say, don't do it. And the missionaries decided that. And that's okay. But he was a ham radio operator like I am. And he was a member of the local Colombian radio club. And that local radio club got together and they said, if we don't pay that ransom, they're going to kill him. And we don't want him to be killed. And 10 of them put $10,000 each into a fund and paid the $100,000 ransom. Now, at that time, for $10,000 in Colombia, you could have bought a new house or a new car. And they gave the value of a house or of a new car to pay the ransom for this guy. And I said, boy, that's a lot of money and all that. And they said, a friend is worth more than money. A friend is worth more than money. We Americans wouldn't do that. We'd say, oh, too bad, he got kidnapped. I'm going to kill the guy. Too bad there. But we wouldn't take the value of our house immediately and pull it out and give it to someone. And I can prove that to you. There are people dying in this world that have never heard about the Lord Jesus Christ. I live in a country where nobody had heard about Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Hardly, maybe a few dozen, a few hundred maybe, when I got there. And if somebody doesn't go and preach how will they hear unless someone preach? And how will they preach unless they be sent? And pray to the Lord of the harvest that he send workers into the harvest, because the harvest is great and the workers are few. If we care enough about other people, then we will give sacrificially and meaningfully so that those workers can go and so that those workers can preach. And we will take out until we feel it and until it hurts, because that hurt isn't as great as the loss when that person is lost and goes to hell because they have never heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. In the book of Ezekiel, he sees a vision twice. Once in the beginning, once in the middle of the book. And the vision is the vision of a watchman. And the watchman's supposed to be watching. And the Lord says to Ezekiel, I've placed you as a watchman over the house of Israel. And if the watchman sees the danger coming and he calls out and the people hear the danger and they take care, they'll be saved. And if they hear and they don't take care, they'll be lost. But he says, but their blood will be on their own hands because you warned them. And they did not take care. But then he goes on and he continues. He says, but as a watchman, if you do not warn them and danger comes and the sword falls and they perish, says they will perish. And then he ends, but he says, but their blood will I require at your hands. Their blood will I require at your hands. And so the people that are out there that are not hearing about Jesus Christ, if it's because you haven't given, someday God will say to you, their blood will I require at your hands. You don't believe me? The Apostle Paul, when he got called to the elder, he got called the elders at Antioch down, and he gave his last message to them and all that. And he sits there and he's talking to them about what's going to happen. He says, grievous wolves will come among the flock and all that, and he's talking to them. But then he says, and I can picture the Apostle Paul maybe lifting his hands up, he did. He says, for I am innocent of the blood of all men, because I have not failed to preach the gospel to every person. Can you lift your hands up before the Lord today and say that? Many of us shamefully would have to admit that we cannot. I try always to share the gospel, but there's been times I failed when I could have and I was too tired, or I thought I was too tired or whatever, and I didn't do it. And I resolved to not let that happen, that I'm going to share it. As I said last night, we either have to go, we have to send, or we sin. Thank you. God bless.